Psalm 34 is David's story of lostness, of hopelessness, of despair. But it's also David's story of what God did for him in the midst of incredibly trying circumstances. This morning we're going to look basically at verses 7 and 8. But before we do that, I want to bring to you a story. Now, I like stories and I hope that you like stories. So here's a story. When I was a young boy, we lived beside a golf course with a wood behind the house. I would play often in that wood. In that wood was a tree, and on the tree was a tree swing, and it swung out quite a distance. I'd seen some older boys swinging from it, and I knew that I wanted to give it a go as well. So I summoned up all my 9-year-old courage one Saturday morning. So there was I, climbing up a tree in front of older boys who agreed to give me a turn. I was there on the branch with the rope in my hands, 9-year-old adrenaline pumping, but I was frozen to the spot. I tried to summon up the courage to do it, to swing out, but I couldn't. It was a lost cause. It was hopeless. After some jeering and name calling, I climbed down the tree, embarrassed, ashamed, defeated, and ran home crying. The swing had defeated me. As a child, I often went back and stood in front of that tree and looked longingly, but I never did summon up the courage to venture up the tree and attempt to swing out. I'd lost all hope of doing so. So we eventually moved away from that house, and that scene from my childhood faded from my mind. But life's circumstances as I grew older followed that trajectory of losing confidence, of not having hope, of being defeated. Right through my teenage years and into adulthood, the tree swing seemed to be a metaphor that characterised my whole life. Hopeless, cowardly, lacking in confidence, and terribly, terribly lost. I was pursued by this relentlessly as an adult. So Psalm 34 is David's story of transformation and hope in the midst of trying and really difficult circumstances. What circumstances? Well, we can find those circumstances if we look into 1 Samuel. And for a few moments, I want to give you some background and context to what we find here in this passage. The first thing I want to focus on is David's hopeless circumstance. So there's 3 particular strands to this one point that I want to try and bring out to us here this morning. And the first one is this. According to 1 Samuel 20, from verse 1 right through to the end, David is fleeing from Saul. Saul is the king at the time, and Saul is, if you read the passage, expecting David to turn up to a meal that he is putting together. And David decides that he's going to flee because he knows that Saul's got it in for him. And of course, there's the whole discourse in 1 Samuel 20 about Jonathan and David discussing together what will happen when Saul notices that David is missing. So David decides to flee for his life. The second thing is that David decides to flee to Ahimelech. Now, Ahimelech is a priest, and David goes there in 1 Samuel 21 to Ahimelech. And while he's there, here's the context of this bit. While he's there, he wants to be fed with the showbread from the sacrifice, and also he wants to know whether Ahimelech has got any spears or swords or things that he can use to arm himself against Saul and his armies, perhaps, when they come looking for him. And the thing that is found is the sword that David has used in the past. If we know the story of David and Goliath, it's that Goliath sword that David took from Goliath after he slayed him. And there Ahimelech gives David this Goliath's sword. And one would think that, okay, if you've used that sword in the past, you can use it again to fight off any enemies that come. But David does the third thing, the most stupid thing, I guess, and actually I wonder whether the writer of the psalm, David himself, is actually telling this a bit tongue-in-cheek, because where does David go to with this sword of Goliath? He goes to Gath. Exactly the town, the city of Gath. And he goes to Gath to flee from Saul. What a stupid idea. And if you read into 1 Samuel 21, you find that David is found there in the midst of Gath with Goliath's sword, in the midst of the Philistine enemy. What a crazy place to be, to flee for his life. His life is even more in danger now. And of course, the Philistines know the sword. They know David. And again, David is in fear of his life from one of the Philistine kings, one king who is king in Gath. So there's the background to this psalm. David's hopeless circumstance. He finds himself out of his depth and perhaps full of despair and hope. Where David wrote this psalm is anyone's guess, but it could have been in the cave of Adullam or around that particular time, but certainly the context is found in 1 Samuel 20 and 1 Samuel 21. The second thing that I want to mention in this short sermon today is David's messenger of hope. And there in verse 7, we find David saying that the angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him. Now I want us to pause there for a moment and just open up a little bit more about the angel of the Lord. In the Old Testament, the angel of the Lord is a description given to the God who turns up, in a sense, in the flesh, a God who is incarnate. And how do we know that? Well, the angel of the Lord is separate from God. He often speaks on behalf of God. He's an agent of God, an ambassador of God in the midst of God's people. We find the angel of the Lord speaking in Genesis 18, appearing to Abraham. We find him in Genesis 32, wrestling with Jacob. We find the angel of the Lord present in Exodus chapter 3 at the burning bush. The angel of the Lord is in the pillar of cloud and fire in Exodus 13, and the angel of the Lord is spoken about by Job in Job 38. And of course, there are many other stories about the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament. Now, the angel of the Lord is described by theologians as a theophany, as an appearance of God, as an appearance of God's power and authority in the midst of life. Now, it's really important that we focus and we pause for a moment on this statement that David makes. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him. And as in other Psalms, we were asking the question a few weeks ago when I was opening up a psalm and trying to track a particular trajectory through it. It's really important that we ask when we come to the psalm, how do we find our way to Jesus? Well, here in verse 7 is how we find our way to Jesus. Many theologians believe that the appearances of the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament is the appearance of none other than Jesus himself, pre-incarnate Jesus himself in the midst. The way that the writers in the Old Testament describe this angel of the Lord is a description of someone who not only speaks on behalf of God, but somehow is God, speaks as God in the midst. And of course, when we come to this final incarnation in the Gospels of Jesus, there incarnate the Son of God throughout the Gospels, we see his power, his authority, that he speaks as God in the midst. So there's a little bit here about David's messenger of hope, and it's in the midst of his troubles that David testifies to the angel of the Lord encamping around those who fear him. We could say in our own hearts and in our own experience of Jesus that Jesus is closer to us than a brother. We could also focus on the fact that Jesus says, I will never leave you nor forsake you. We could go to the passage in Luke 24 where Jesus accompanies the two disciples on the road, not as an angel but as a stranger. We could go to lots of places to open up this particular thought that we find in verse 7. I want us to also focus this morning on the third thing. And I think this is really an important thing in verse 8. Taste and see that the Lord is good. We've already just opened up briefly David's hopeless circumstance that he finds himself in, running for his life from Saul, running for his life from the king of Gath. And in that story of the king of Gath, David feigns mental illness. What an atrocious thing to do. But he feigns mental illness to try and have the king of Gath take pity on him so that he could escape. What horrible circumstances that David finds himself in, lying, cheating, running in fear of his life. What an incredibly hopeless situation. And here it is in verse 8 that David encourages those who are hearing this psalm, those who are reading this psalm, to test things out themselves, to taste and see that the Lord is good. Here is David's encouragement to hope. So we've looked at David's hopeless circumstance, David's messenger of hope, the angel of the Lord, and now David's encouragement of hope. And I want to spend just a little bit more time on verse 8 than we have done in the previous two thoughts. Taste and see is an invitation. This is David's invitation to all who read the psalm, to you and I who are hearing the psalm today, in our own hearts, in the midst perhaps of some hopeless circumstances, to taste and see that the Lord is good. Just for a moment, just contemplate what is being asked of us today. Will you and I taste and see the goodness of God in the midst of our trying circumstances? Will we take the Lord up on that invitation? Will we discover in our lives a new sense of hope, a new sense of hope despite the despair that we find ourselves in? Alongside this invitation, David explains another big biblical theme, and it's that theme of refuge. Those who taste and see, David has found refuge in the Lord. This is what the whole psalm is about. It's about transformation. It's about the God who comes and intervenes in people's lives. We can relate that right back to Jesus as well. We can find that link. It's at the most trying moments under the Roman occupation of Palestine, over the Roman occupation or overrunning of the people of God in Jesus' day, that Jesus comes. He's incarnated into the world to bring hope amidst the despair. And Jesus says in Matthew 11:28, all you who are weary, come to me, and I will give you rest. Here is the voice of hope in the ministry of Jesus. There's a great theme that is opened up for a little here in verse 8 of Psalm 34, and it's that of refuge. Of course, in the Old Testament, there are places of refuge. There are cities of refuge. The Lord is known as the God of refuge. There's that sense in this passage, in microcosm here in verse 8. This is David's testimony. It's his own story of how he has found hope right there in the midst of despair. Now, we could do with a bit of hope, couldn't we? Again, we're here, we're found. Where are we found? We're found in the midst of perhaps a hopeless pandemic, where it's difficult to know who to trust and what to trust in regard to information. These are trying and difficult times. We know personally, don't we, of people who have contracted COVID-19. We know in our own church people who have succumbed to that great pandemic. And if ever there was a need for hope, it's today we need that hope. You may find yourselves as a church in that place. Personally, you may find yourselves in that place in your own families, in your own community. You may find yourself lacking hope. And here we have David's testimony on how he found hope in the midst of great despair, great trials. And I must say, some of what David went through was of his own making. And I guess if we were true to say, some of what we go through is what is thrust upon us, but sometimes also it's of our own making that we find ourselves in desperate circumstances, just like David. I know that's true for me. There are moments when, well, I have to live with the consequences of mistakes that I have made, especially mistakes in the past. But this invite to taste and see that the Lord is indeed good. Taste and see that God, our Jesus, is good. To taste and see that our God, our Jesus, by the Spirit of God today, can offer us the same kind of refuge as what was offered to David. Okay, we may not be in those circumstances. We may not be fleeing for our lives, wondering whether or not we'll survive till the end of today. But there are situations across the world that for God's people, that is absolutely the case. There are wars, there are famine, there is all sorts of things, persecution that happen to God's people. You and I may be in different circumstances, but nevertheless just as real, just as impacting as what we find in this psalm. I challenge you to read the whole of the psalm. We've not done justice to it. We've simply just focused on a few things this morning. And just to give you those 3 bullet points again, if you're taking notes, you might want to write them down. David's hopeless circumstances. The second thing, David's messenger of hope, the angel of the Lord, that theologians point and say this is Jesus in the Old Testament. And the third thing, David's encouragement to hope, to taste and see that the Lord is good, and that all who taste and see might find a refuge in God. What an incredibly encouraging psalm for us this morning, and for us to contemplate briefly in a simple reflection and a simple sermon here today. It's David's story. It's personal to him. It's his telling of that story in Psalm 34. real events happening to a real person in a real particular set of circumstances. You and I daily go through real events, personal to us, and we find ourselves often in trying and difficult circumstances. But will I respond to the invitation that is given to us to taste of the Lord? And taste actually is quite a metaphor here in the scriptures. We could feed into that metaphor also another psalm, Psalm 23, where David, also writing in Psalm 23, says, there is set before me a table in the presence of my enemies. There's something of tasting there too. We could think about the metaphors that run through the Old Testament of Thanksgiving, of Passover meals, of feasts where people come together, of eating. And of course that's true for Jesus. Jesus loved nothing more than to gather with friends and with enemies to eat and to talk and to discuss. And here we've got this taste metaphor. Also, taste and see. There's something here of a new beholding, a new opening up, a new discovery, seeing. There's a moment in Luke chapter 5 when Peter is confronted with the huge catch of fish. And the story in Luke 5, in the writing of Luke, says this: and Peter, when he saw, and in the Greek, actually, that isn't there. It reads like this in the original language in Luke 5. And Peter, having seen. Now, it's really interesting, and it fits with this taste and see that we find in Psalm 34. It wasn't the miracle that Peter saw in Luke 5. It was the person of Jesus that he saw in Luke 5. No ordinary person. And he felt so humbled that he had to say, Lord, depart from me, for I am an evil man. To taste and to see. John in 1 John 29 says, behold the Lamb of God. We thought about that a few weeks ago. But to behold, to take another look, to take a more intentional look, to see with the eyes of faith, to hold on to think through, to reflect just a little bit more. And of course, this is what this verse 8 does in Psalm 34. To taste, to ruminate in our mouths, to enjoy fellowship and food, and to see, to take another look, a bigger look, a more intentional look at this, yes, angel of the Lord, because it comes off the back of verse 7. It's quite clear to me that verse 7 and 8 go together. You don't need to be a man on a galloping horse to see that. And so David here, speaking of the Lord, tasting and seeing that the Lord is good, could be a absolute parallel to what we find in verse 7, where David speaks about the angel of the Lord encamping around those who fear him. So we could say that we taste and we see more of Jesus Christ. This is the invitation that comes to us today. Whatever we think of this psalm, whatever we think of what we find in terms of themes in this psalm, one thing is absolutely certain. And the thing that's certain is that this is an encouragement, a testimony of David to hope in the midst of trying circumstances. Rachel and I had only been married a short time, and James was only very small, and we had travelled to Scotland, to the island of Bute, to Rothsay, to see my mum and dad. On one of those days that we were spending at mum and dad's, I decided to go for a walk by myself. I wanted to go and explore my old house by the golf course. And as I got there, I wondered if the tree swing was still there. To my utter surprise, it wasn't only just there, but someone had renewed the rope on the swing fairly recently. So there I was, standing on the branch as a full-grown adult, with the adrenaline pumping. I took the rope in my hand, and in one move I swung out. It was delicious. It was exhilarating, as it was so exhilarating. The longing of a 9-year-old boy was now fulfilled. I swung many times there on the swing, and in the end I lay in the branches of the tree on my own in the sun. There as a 9-year-old boy I laughed and cried, and I won. No more embarrassment, no more defeat, no more lack of confidence, but a rising hope that this tree swing would be a new metaphor in my life, one of hope and not defeat.